You wouldn't think this is Great Britain. Behind closed doors, people across the country are living in homes not fit for humans, left completely trapped. And the dirty secret is they are being housed by the British state. So why have they been so neglected, and what needs to be done to change it? I'm Nina Hossain, and this is What You Need to Know. Hello and welcome to today's episode of What You Need to Know. I'm joined by our investigations editor, Daniel Hewitt, whose podcast, The Trapped, comes out today. Daniel, why this and why now?
Well, by any measure, Nina, Britain is in the grip of a housing crisis, and we hear that phrase crisis a lot, but there doesn't feel a sufficient word to describe the kind of level of neglect, the level of squalor, the level of desperation that hundreds of thousands of people are currently facing in this country. We began this investigation almost 4 years ago, but to this day, the email address that we set up, housingstories@itv.com, the people we met many years ago are still living in conditions you wouldn't frankly leave an animal in, living in homes not fit for human habitation, but also people trapped in temporary homes, trapped in hostels and bed and breakfast, people homeless with nowhere to go. Wherever you turn, the kind of housing crisis casts a wider and wider net each day. And I think as a subject, as a topic, housing has been one, frankly, that the media has neglected for far too long. And so when we started this investigation 4 years ago, we by no means thought we'd still be talking about it now. But I think the levels we found have been so shocking and so appalling, and the human consequences of this crisis mean that it carries on. And that is why we felt it was so important to reach out to a different audience. And that's why we created The Trapped.
Shall we hear a clip?
Behind every front door is a story of dreams or of desperation, success or struggle. Almost 4 years ago, I went behind one front door and found a dirty secret. Oh my God. It looks like there's been a fire.
It's terrible.
People living in homes not fit for humans. This is dangerous housing.
Exactly.
Like, you shouldn't be here, should you?
No.
Left completely trapped.
I feel just neglected. I just don't even feel like I'm a human.
And the dirty secret? They were being housed by the British state.
You wouldn't think that this is in Great Britain. Incredible.
And I soon learned they were not alone.
Not even an animal is treated like this.
I'm feeling suffocated in here, breathless, fatigue.
It's not my fault, but I can't do anything about it.
So, as an investigative journalist, I set out to discover why. Have you told them about the problems in here?
I told them. So they don't care. They don't care.
I've seen things I could never have imagined.
The ceiling's about to collapse. It's gonna collapse. Told them! Told them! I told them!
We're two people that are quite hard to shock after everything we've seen, but I can't get over this.
It's like a living nightmare, isn't it?
And confronted the people responsible.
I've not had an opportunity. I would like
what have you been doing that's more important than contacting the woman living in the worst housing conditions in Britain?
No, but yeah.
I think it's disgusting. We're not seriously saying that the government have nothing to do with this.
A lot has happened since I walked through that first door.
My children, my husband. I have nowhere to go. I can't believe that this is happening.
The investigation has helped get some people out, inspired others to speak out.
I didn't care that they were the biggest housing association in Europe. I wanted to teach them a lesson.
We've even forced a change in the law and seen a change in government.
I want to see those homes built that the people of this country desperately need.
But almost 4 years on, people in Britain are still trapped.
It's not fair. I just want to leave. I don't want to be living in this condition.
And I'm still asking questions. So come with me behind the closed doors and see for yourself the country that you really live in. I'm Daniel Hewitt, and this is The Trapped. Listen on thetrapped.co.uk or wherever you get your podcasts.
Dan, it's an incredibly powerful listen, the podcast. And it's a story, an investigation that has come to dominate, you say, sometimes your every thought. And even seeing those pictures in that trailer, you say now, you can't describe to me or anyone how some of those living conditions felt or smelt like.
Yeah, we do our best in The Trapped to talk about what we saw. Sometimes we began this process by saying, well, can we in any way convey kind of in audio what we saw on our TV screens? And in some ways, actually, I think it's more powerful because we're able to go into what we found in so much more detail, and those stories that we weren't able to put in a kind of television package that many people would have seen on our TV screens. But you're right. One thing I struggle to really explain, and I do my best in The Trapped, but is to try and explain how I felt about it. And it's not about us. The story isn't about what we did. It's more about what people are living in. But that first story, the first place we visited on Regina Road in Croydon, I remember standing outside and looking back at this tower block, which from the outside gave no hint to the kind of horrors we found inside. It was a kind of almost modern-looking cream-coloured cladding building with red trims around the windows, and it felt like a kind of, you would never know what was happening inside. And I stood there and I was kind of shaking with anger because it was so much more than just people living in poor housing conditions. It was about power. How had these people been left to live like this? They were telling everyone they could find about how they were living, and they were being ignored. They were being ignored for months and months and months. And that's why, for me, the investigation has lasted for so long, because it isn't just about people living in poor housing conditions. It's about the country we live in. It's about how you get heard, who doesn't, who gets the benefit of the doubt, who doesn't. It's so much more than just a story about housing. And that's been proven really by the fact that from that first report we got hundreds of emails the next day. We had thousands since from people living in similar conditions, and the investigation has broadened over time. But it really goes back to that first report. That anger that I felt and the team here felt was what really spurred us on, and continues to spur us on.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? As journalists, we have to be impartial, but when you are confronted by what you and the camera person, Ted, that you were with, saw, you can't help but have that instinct, that reaction, that passion, that anger that you are describing. And also, you both had instant impact on your health as well. And you were in there for the time it took to film in those conditions. This is what these people are living through and sleeping through, and it's their children as well.
That's right. I mean, Leroy, who lived above Franzoy, so we met Franzoy. We talk about in The Trapped how we met her and how we started the investigation, and we went, after we'd visited Franzoy's flat, we went upstairs to Leroy's flat, where kind of you'd think, well, it was obvious with the leak. If the leak's coming down to the ground floor, it's obviously coming from above, and it turned out it was coming from above Leroy. For me, that was the moment where I realised that there was a kind of problem here, because Leroy had accepted the situation.
He was resigned.
Yeah, he had tried and tried and tried to get hold of Croydon Council and had failed and had just given up. And even though you can hear Franzoy's voice and she's cracking up and she's trying to do everything, she's desperate to get her and her boys out of that flat, Leroy, as you said, was resigned to the situation. And for me, that was one of the most heartbreaking things, of just people accepting this is how I'm being treated, and this is how I'm going to have to live my life now, because no one's going to do anything about it. And I think for us, we're not campaign journalists. We're independent journalists. We go and report what we find. Eyewitness reporting, I think, is a really important part of what we do. But I think it is about giving a platform and a voice to people that don't have one. You're talking here about tenants that are facing or trying to get hold of councils or housing associations or big landlords who have press offices and PR departments and budgets, and they have nothing, they have no one, they have no platform representing them. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of in this series is that we have been able to give people a voice that don't have one. I don't think that makes it subjective. I think we're objective journalists, and that's what we do. But I think giving people a voice is part of our job, I think.
But just to underline this point, that when you're talking about Leroy trying to get help, any of the tenants you've spoken to, trying to get these basic things sorted out, they're living in dangerous conditions, many of them, and they're getting ignored, and they're having to retell their story again and again and again, which is incredibly stressful. These are people that are in council-run accommodation, and that's paid for by the taxpayer, and yet they're living in these conditions in the first place. But when they try to raise these really serious concerns, they're getting fobbed off.
That's right, and I think we're probably used to, sadly, in this country, hearing stories about sort of slum landlords, private landlords, kind of individual citizens who maybe have a portfolio of properties whose job is and aim is to basically maximise as much profit from those houses as possible, and therefore will do the minimum repairs in order to kind of maximise that profit. I think slum landlords, private rental sector is worse than the social housing sector in terms of disrepair and sort of squalid conditions. But we don't hear a lot about, we haven't heard a lot until we started our investigation about the social housing sector, and that's partly because it shouldn't be like this. I mean, social housing was set up to provide decent, safe, affordable accommodation to people on low incomes who can't afford to rent in the private sector or afford to buy a home. So they're already kind of having to rely on the state to house them. And you're right, this is the most shocking thing, I think, is that this is not being driven in terms of the councils by profit. This is, we found, pure neglect, pure incompetence. Now, local authorities have been under huge strain over the last decade in terms of budget cuts. I think that is part of the story here. But when we turn to housing associations, which is a slightly different kettle of fish, non-for-profit organisations who are helped through taxpayer funding, through housing benefit, again, they're non-for-profit. They're meant to provide decent, affordable homes, and their aim shouldn't be to make a profit. But as the investigation went on, we started following the money and realising some of these big housing associations that, again, were set up with the best intentions to provide decent, affordable, safe housing. Some of their CEOs are earning £300,000-400,000 a year. Their budgets are absolutely enormous. Their turnover, in some cases, pushes over the £1 billion mark. So when we would see the houses and the conditions people were living in, and then we'd check out the housing association and think, well, their CEO earns £350,000 a year. They're in a glitzy skyscraper in central London and they're turning over £1 billion. Something's gone wrong here. This disconnect makes absolutely no sense. Now, I'm not excusing Croydon Council and others, but from council level, they have had huge budget restraints. In the housing association sector, it's very different. And in the traps, we go into that to look into why that is the case.
We've covered a bit of the how we got here, but the podcast also sees you confront some of those people responsible for the state we're in.
Yeah, we do. And that's from sort of central government. We interviewed 2 housing secretaries, Robert Jenrick and Michael Gove, and their responses to our investigation is a real contrast. It's really interesting to hear that same party, very different approaches. But we also kind of go after the people responsible, go after the landlords and speak to those organisations, some of whom are very big and who earn big salaries and turn over lots of money, and find out what they're doing. Why have they not been doing the most basic thing, which is repairing properties that people are living in? And those people, by the way, are the people paying your wages. They're the people paying rent. And it's worth pointing this out. Social housing is not just for people who don't work. The majority of the people we met are people working really hard, going to work, paying their rent. And if they missed a rent payment by a single day, that housing association or council would be on them like a flash. And yet when they're calling and calling and calling, they're not getting anywhere. And we put that to the housing bosses who apologise, but often it's, in some cases, dragged out of them.
One of the most striking things I heard was the description of a poor mum having to have an umbrella over her kids' Christmas dinner. When we use words like housing crisis and housing conditions and social housing, all that jargon, I think sometimes it can lose people because they're not living through this on a day-to-day basis. But when you describe something like that, you just think, how in 2021, still now in 2024, do we live in a country where that's happening?
Absolutely. And I think that has been, we could talk about this for hours, but I've reflected on this a lot in the last few years, and still to this day reporting on this issue. I mean, on last Friday, just a few days ago, I was in a flat in West London with a mum of 3 who's just been complaining to a housing association for months, and the flat is in appalling condition. They've moved into temporary accommodation, and then she's discovered that while she's been in temporary accommodation, she put a little camera in her flat because she didn't trust the housing association to do the work they said they would do. The cameras caught a builder rummaging through their possessions, going through their drawers, her underwear drawer, her children's clothes. And this is, it's how we treat people in Britain. This is what the Trapped is all about. It's examining how people on low incomes living in social housing, who I believe have been made to feel like they should be grateful for having a social home because there's such a chronic shortage of them. This is how people are treated. I think part of the problem over the years is when us as a profession, but also politically, have discussed housing, we've sort of automatically, our brain has automatically gone to affordability, the housing ladder, young people being frozen out, and that's fine. They're all legitimate
mortgage
stories.
Rates.
Mortgage rates,
yeah.
exactly. They're perfectly legitimate stories, but we haven't focused on kind of people really at the bottom who don't have a voice, who've been screaming into the void for so long. And I think that's why we got the reaction we got 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, because it was almost like a clarion call. It was almost like when that first report went on ITV News, hundreds and hundreds and then thousands of people across the country said, wow, someone's actually looking into my life and what I live like. And Franzo and Leah's flat was like holding up a mirror to their life. It was like, that's what I'm struggling with. And so I think that's part of the reason we've gone on and on and on, and why we've now produced this podcast, The Trapped, because we do think that there is a group of people in this country who haven't had their stories told.
Well, they're powerless. I think you have summed it up as tenants complaining, tenants ignored, tenants in danger. Now, you have spoken. There is hope because there's a new government, and with a new government brings new hope. You've spoken to Angela Rayner, tasked with this very, very problem. But again, we have to listen to the promises of politicians, listen to the promises of this next government, and we don't know yet whether this government will be the one that actually begins to tackle this situation with real house building, with real change, with real numbers.
Absolutely. I mean, the slight problem with housing is that and I think politically this is partly why I think both main political parties, including the Liberal Democrats, who are also in coalition, have slightly got away with not having the problem pinned on them, is that this is a problem that goes back 40, 50 years. I say in the Trapped, if you wanted to create a housing crisis, you would pretty much do to the letter what we've done in Britain in the last 40 years. And we talk about the history of housing and how we got here in the podcast, and Right to Buy under Margaret Thatcher. The issue here ultimately is there are not enough affordable homes, and they haven't been built for decades at the level they should be. We've lost over 1 million homes since the early 80s in terms of social homes because of Right to Buy. They haven't been replaced. Last year, if you look at the numbers, we sold and demolished more social housing than we built last year in England. So at a time when we know that there are more than 1 million families on the social housing waiting list, when we know that those in social housing in some cases are suffering some really poor, some cases dangerous conditions, the solution is building more homes. And we're not only not building them, we're still selling them off and demolishing them. So we put it to Angela Rayner and we said, what are you going to do? Labour has promised to build 1.5 million homes in the next Parliament. I've pushed her in the podcast. You hear an interview with Angela Rayner where I push her on how many of those will be social homes. And I think Labour have so far not been specific about how many social homes they want to build. They accept they're the homes that need to be built to solve the problems we talk about throughout the podcast, not just conditions, but also temporary accommodation and homelessness. But Labour have been kind of remarkably so far unspecific on their plans.
So we're still in a watch and wait situation.
Yeah, we are. And I think I told, Housing Secretary told us that she's working with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves are working together for the spending review next year to work out how they're going to build, how many they're going to build, what they're going to build, where they're going to build it. But I think that the housing sector, I'm told, is really waiting for that spending review at the start of next year, because that's when we'll find out really what Labour's plans are. They claim they want to build the biggest number of council houses and social houses in a generation. To put that into context, it wouldn't be that difficult because we've hardly built any for the last generation. But so the minimum they could do is build more than they have been.
Look, with this situation, with any situation, we need hope and we need optimism. And what your investigation has done so far in terms of the 4 years that you've been working on it, in part, has led to an absolute, concrete, solid change in the law. Just tell listeners and viewers what that change is. Yeah, so broadly speaking, the first half of the podcast series focuses on the social housing conditions that we found. We were called to Parliament. Our investigation led to a parliamentary inquiry into what was happening. And then when Michael Gove became the Housing Secretary under the previous Conservative government, they looked again at the Social Housing Regulation Bill, which was kind of going through Parliament, but was very slowly, didn't have a lot of detail in it. Government had basically parked it and weren't doing much with it. Michael Gove got hold of it, and as a result of our work, said in Parliament on a number of occasions that he was inspired by the work we'd done to help change the law. And one of the big changes that was made was the social housing regulator, which up until we started our investigation and during it, wasn't able to, and this is incredible, wasn't able to visit properties or speak to tenants. And in one of the episodes, we go into a kind of just remarkable case where one housing association effectively admits wrongdoing, apologises,
fixes all these problems on this entire estate, and yet the regulator still finds them not guilty. And we go into why. That has now changed. The social housing regulator has the power to inspect. It has the power to interview tenants. It has the power to order repairs to be done in a much shorter space. The housing ombudsman has now as much power, a much more power, a much wider remit. Housing associations now are subject to much higher punishments in terms of fines, and so that all of that didn't exist until 18 months ago. So there has been change in this sector. The big change will come when houses are built, but there has been progress. I would say hope and joy are not really my currency in my current job.
I said optimism, but we can aim for joy.
But there are glimpses of hope in this series, and I think, and we've also had people we've met who've been moved out and moved into safe accommodation and are now living their lives in much nicer accommodation and safer housing, which is kind of one of the proudest things I think we've achieved, is to help some people out, but obviously a lot more to do.
You should be very proud, you and the whole team who's worked on this for so long and unfortunately has to continue working on it. I just want to end with asking you, for anyone who listens and watches to the podcast, and I really think people should take some time out to listen to it, to realise how people
and tell
are
everyone
living.
you know about it.
Absolutely. What do you hope the podcast series, The Trapped, achieves?
I hope it brings to a kind of new audience the scale of the crisis. I think we can live in silos in this country. I think if we're okay, we sort of think that's okay, and we got to get glimpses of other people's lives, but not to this extent. I think if you want to really know what people mean by the housing crisis, you should listen to this podcast. If you want to know what it's like to live in Britain, if you've not got a lot of money and if you don't have options, you should listen to this podcast. If you want to know how the state treats people, you should listen to this podcast. But I think for me, it's about, and I said this in The Trapped, it really is about power. It's about who has it and who doesn't. And this podcast kind of lays bare, for those who don't have power, what life can throw at you. And it's pretty bleak. But as I say, we do offer some glimpses of hope, and on our website, which we've set up, thetrap.co.uk, you can go to a dedicated page which sets out all the different organisations and places that you can go to seek help, to get advice, and there's loads and loads of information on the website, thetrap.co.uk. Yeah, because even after Grenfell, so many people are still so powerless, and let's hope that this new body of work and that website and everybody you've spoken to and every bit of hard work that's gone into this podcast affects even more change, because it's clearly overdue. Daniel Hewitt, thank you very much, and thank you for listening. For more on this, you can head over to thetrapped.co.uk, where you can see all the visuals and hear every episode that Dan was talking about there. You can also find the series wherever you get your podcasts, and do have a look back through our other quick briefings on a range of headline topics to find out what you need to know.